Welcome, everybody, for our class on Judaism at the vanguard of the future. I'm Rabbi Geoff Mitelman. I am connected with WRT. I teach Torah study about once a month, so I know a lot of you through Torah study. I live in Harrison, so I'm very close nearby, and I am the founding director of an organization called Sinai and Synapses, which bridges the worlds of religion and science, tries to be able to explore questions of how do we look at some of the biggest questions that we face in this world where we need wisdom from science, we need wisdom from religion. Very often those are viewed as coming in conflict over and against each other, but so many of the questions that we grapple with are really human questions. They're not scientific questions and they're not religious questions. They're human questions. And a lot of the questions that we're starting to think about now, particularly in Sinai and Synapses, is not just questions of evolution and creation. That's often a discussion that comes in, or even we talk a lot about psychology. If you've done some of my classes before, I do a lot about the role of psychology in Judaism. One of the things that has become really interesting and important is the onset of technology and the role that technology plays in who we are. And so what we're going to be looking at today is this question of, are we using technology or is technology using us? We're going to look at a few different texts here as well. And then looking at specific questions of the ways in which technology and new technologies are raising questions of humanity, range everything from what happens, and I think this is a when and not if, when we discover life on other planets. What will that mean for us theologically? When we're looking at new genetic technology, CRISPR-Cas9 technology, is that allowing us to play God? We're going to be looking at just all these different questions where technology and humanity interplay. So what I want to actually start at, and I want to open this up and people can use their virtual raise hand. If you have your video on, you can also physically raise your hand. I should be able to see you. But I want to start by asking the question, how do we define technology? When we even think about technology, you can either think of like, what's your immediate reaction? So there's no wrong answer to this, but when you think of when we use the word technology, what is that word that we should be, when you hear the word technology, what does it mean? What are the implications when you think about that word? So you can use the technology of raise your hand on Zoom, or you can physically do like this, and hopefully I can be able to see you there. You know what? I will. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Doug.
Well, simply put, it's the use of tools.
Yeah.
Okay, so what tools do you mean?
Could be anything. I mean, it could be a chimpanzee using a stick to dig out grubs, or it could be, a space shot.
So,
but I guess it's the use of some object or device outside of the physical limitations of the body.
So there are a couple of different things that you bring up. One is extending the physical limitations of the body. That's a critical element of this, and that's why when we think about what makes humans unique, this is going to be a question that's going to come up a lot of what makes humans unique. And people often say the use of tools, and the use of tools is part of that. But you bring up a really important point, which is that other animals use tools in different kinds of ways. Now, I don't think we would say chimps are the same as humans, but chimpanzees have a form of a technology there. They're trying to move beyond what just the physical limitations and what our own particular bodies can use to be able to make their lives easier. So that's a terrific definition. Arlene, thank you. Oh, yep.
I think of it as scientific knowledge. I'm not sure that you always have to think of it in terms of tools. So I think technology has been around for as long as we've been around, except that now we're using a lot of instruments to kind of facilitate the use of the knowledge.
That's a great point. There's an interplay of science and technology, but they're not the same. There was a great example of this. I'm going to give a couple of examples of this. If we were to, I don't know what the exact number is, but let's say, for example, the melting point of lead. The melting point of lead, I believe, someone can correct me on this and someone can check this on this, but I believe that the melting point of lead is, let's say 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. How would we know this without being able to develop the tools of a thermometer, right? If you were to use your finger, as Doug said, if we were to use just our bodies, if you were to put your finger into molten lead, all you would know is it's hot. You can't really draw the distinction of 200 degrees versus 500 degrees versus 1200 degrees. So being able to develop the tools of understanding what the melting point of lead is, there is a technology there that allows us to be able to figure this out. Another great example, this is from a thinker named Adam Frank, who wrote a book called About Time. He's an astrophysicist, and he asked this question of 3,000 years ago, was there a 2:17 p.m.? And I'm going to phrase that again. Was there a 2:17 p.m. 3,000 years ago? And on some level, the answer is, of course there was a 2:17 p.m. because the Earth was going around the sun, and that's what the time was. But 3,000 years ago, there was not a clear distinction of 2:17 p.m. to be able to know this is what time this is going to be. So the development of calendars, of clocks, of having exact times. One of the reasons that we have different time zones is because of the advent of railroads. So being able to understand the precision that science allows, technology helped advance that science. So I think that's a terrific description there. Thank you, Arlene. Other thoughts and definitions of what technology is or could be used for? Yeah, Dave, go ahead.
I think it's also, to me, in a way, it's really applied science. It's hard to me to conceive of technology without, in a way, having a science and applying it. It's one thing to understand the laws of optics. It's another thing to build a telescope.
Mm-hmm.
Or just as it's one way to know about steam, another to build a steam engine, or then to apply that to build a locomotive. And from that, you get railroads.
Mm-hmm.
It makes, notion of steel, and then you make rails and you build railroads. So the two, is in a way, it's applied science. And that's, to me, that's what engineering means.
Yeah, it is. Science has an element of pure research. In the same way that, by the way, Torah has a view of Torah lishma, Torah for its own sake. Science has value for its own sake, but technology, almost by definition, is designed to be applied. I think it was Niels Bohr who was doing a lot of great research and said, "I understand how it works in practice. Tell me how it works in theory." Or if you saw, I happened to see, it came out a few months ago, if you saw the movie Oppenheimer, that was a lot of those questions of the interplay of the theoretical nature of splitting the atom versus using it to be able to drop a bomb. And nuclear technology now creates power for so many of us. So it is not just a theoretical question. It is also a practical question. How are we going to use it? And I think one of the things that's going to come up in a variety of different ways is that the technology gets applied and gets used, and only then do we understand its ethical implications. Technology, by definition, changes the world. It creates something that is new, that didn't exist before. And that is a question that comes up of, once the world is different, we respond to it ethically here. One of my favorite examples of this is, whether or not the government actually does this is a separate question, but I think we can all agree that, at least in theory, the US government does not have the right to read your emails without your consent. That's against the law. Again, whether they do it or not, that's a different question. But the US government is not allowed to read your emails without your consent. And the law that that requires this is a law that's called the Privacy Act of 1974, 50 years old. Because the government and Jewish thought and philosophy and religion, every institution is slow. Technology is extremely fast. Silicon Valley's methodology is move fast and break things. And the question becomes, well, when it's applied, how do we put it back together? There's a tension between religion and ethics and technology here. Maybe one or two other thoughts of when we think about technology. What does it mean? What is that? How is it used in this? And by the way, we can also think about in the last 10, 15 years of the way technology is used. Yeah, go ahead, Rita.
Yes, I think that possibly it could be boiled down to using something outside the body to change how you behave. And I'm thinking that many thousands of years ago, women discovered that if you insert a stone into your body, you might not become pregnant as quickly. And that would be a feminine example of using a tool, if you will, in a very new way, which then changes the social system, because once women have control over their fertility, all kinds of things change, as we see now in our own cultural system, a big fight over that. What kind of technology should be available for people in terms of reproduction?
Yeah, you bring up that's a terrific point, that technology is also not just physical, it's also social. It changes implications in this way. There's a wonderful science fiction show on Apple TV now called For All Mankind, which I highly recommend if you haven't seen it. The idea of For All Mankind is what would have happened if the Russians had landed on the moon a month before Neil Armstrong. And that's how the show starts, and it's now in its fourth season. But it raises all of these different social questions where I'm not giving too much away, but one of the things where Nixon ends up losing the 1972 election because the Russians landed first. So Ted Kennedy becomes the president in 1972, and there's a whole piece about there's horse trading that deals with the ERA in 1972. So when we're thinking about the technological elements, whether that's reproductive technology, whether that's what NASA is creating for us, that creates social implications that we don't always understand. These are questions that when we talk in a couple of weeks about artificial intelligence, what are the ways in which not just there are advancements in physical technology, what are there advancements in mental and language technology? That's going to raise a lot of questions as well. This is something, by the way, the Writers Guild of America was fighting against. That's why they were on strike for however many months, because they were worried, understandably, that artificial intelligence was going to replace them. And so it creates not just here's the technological advancement of what they call large language models that we'll talk about in a couple of weeks, but writers need to get paid. They need to be able to create new movie and television scripts. So the technology and the social elements intertwined in a variety of different ways. So thank you, Rita. That was a great point. Judith, yeah, go ahead.
I'm thinking of just the pure psychological impact of technology. When you see the word technology, the implications are vast. I am an older person. My granddaughter knows more than I, and a great-grandchild will know more than my granddaughter. And it's also psychologically, technology today is speeding so fast that it's scary in a way, and who knows what's coming. So psychologically, just the word itself and the thought of technology itself, it has a very strong, to me, psychological impact. And the speed at which everything is happening things are changing millisecond. In a millisecond, things change. So anyway, that's my impact on technology and my personal response.
That's a great point. And I think the best definition of technology, I sometimes use this, is technology is whatever developed after you were a kid. So, right, so when you were growing up, radio was not a scary technology here. One of my favorite stories of this, TV was probably not scary for you there, but now like streaming and trying to understand all the apps that you have on your phone, like I can't deal with that, but your kids and grandkids understand this much more. Another one of my favorite examples, by the way, I'm going to be saying a lot, one of my favorite examples, because I like a lot of things. People know about the story. I'm assuming you all think you know the story about the War of the Worlds, right? The Orson Welles and War of the Worlds, right? The story is told that there was a broadcast that said there was panic in the streets and there was rioting, that everybody thought that the Martians were coming and the streets panicked, right? Is that the story everybody's heard? That is not accurate. That is not what happened. Because who told the story? Who was the one who said there was panic in the streets? Where did people find out that story? Anyone know?
On the radio.
No, the radio broadcast was what came out. Where did they find out? Where were the stories that were coming out saying that everybody freaked out and took over the streets? It was not the radio, it was newspapers. The newspapers the next day saying, here's what happened. Why? Because the radio was a technology that allowed you to be able to find out information instantly. Newspapers came the next day. It was a little bit slower. It was a collection of ways of saying, radio is scary. We should not be having instant information. Radio is bad. That's why that story is described this way. Who is telling the story? That's a critical element of this. So people were not panicking in the streets. People say the story is people panicked in the streets because the story came out the next day and it was in the newspapers trying to be able to say, the radio is going to give us instant information and we're going to lose our market share. That's why that story is told. So when we think about, Judith, as you're saying, technology running so quickly, that's always been a question and a challenge. Well, we may even talk about this in over the next couple of weeks, but one of the big revelations in Jewish text and Jewish tradition was the writing down of what's called the oral Torah. So Judaism has what they call two different levels of Torah. One is the written Torah, which is the 5 books of Moses that we read a section of on every Shabbat. And then there was a section that was a few thousand years later called the oral Torah, which is what's called the Mishnah and the Talmud. And as you can probably guess, the Mishnah particularly was an oral tradition, the same way that sort of the ancient Greeks shared their story, that Homer would share his Iliad and Odyssey. The traditions and texts were passed down orally. But when something was written down, it became ossified. It became written down. So there was a big discussion of, should the oral Torah be written down? Because once you write something down, then there's the technology of that, of the papyrus and the piece of paper, and it's written down, it's going to last forever. When you say something, it goes off into the ether. If this conversation, for example, was not being recorded, it would be lost forever. But because we're recording this, we'll be able to have it forever. There was a discussion of, should we write the Torah, the oral Torah, down? Is that going to ossify some of these conversations? That was a technological question that raised theological questions. And then once the Torah oral Torah got physically written down, 1800, 1900, the printing press, the printing press was a few hundred years earlier, but the printing press became the way in which people were able to look at texts and be able to have great access to them. Another example of this in which the technology changed theology. This is from a thinker named Stephen Johnson, who talked about the importance of glass and how glass led to the Protestant Reformation. How did glass happen to the Protestant Reformation? Well, many of us here, including me, are wearing glasses here. If you didn't have reading glasses, you could not, it would be very, very difficult to be able to read the text of what was written that Gutenberg wrote on the printing press. The written text and being able to actually read it and study it and put reading glasses on allowed people to have access to the Bible. It was not just the priest saying up on hi, here is what the Bible says. There were people who, now that they have reading glasses and a printing press, able to actually read the Bible. That democratized Christianity and led to the Protestant Reformation. The text, so it comes back to this question that Rita brought up of the technology and the theology. The technology and the social elements are deeply, deeply intertwined. And so when we're going to be talking about all of these new technological advancements, we're not just going to look at the technological advancements, we're also going to look at how they influence who we are theologically and philosophically and Judaically. So in a second, I want to, go ahead.
I'm not sure where this thought takes us, but it seems to me that technology is always the result of a creative human process.
Yes, I think that's, and I think that's and we're going to look at this in a few different ways of that technology almost by definition is something that is a human creation, and that's there's something that a thinker named Yuval Harari often brings up, which is that an individual human, at least on the African savannah 200,000 years ago, an individual human would not be able to survive on their own. But being able to create as a community, as a band, of being able to have not just learn something new each individual lifetime, but being able to build on the knowledge of those of hundreds of thousands of lifetimes, that's what allows us to be able to build the societies that we have, build Zoom, be able to live in a house, be able to create a structure and a social structure that in many ways, and we're going to talk in a second of what Judaism has to say about this, that technology is at its core, I think, what it means to be human. There is a deep intertwining that goes back evolutionarily hundreds of thousands of years and goes back to actually the opening verses of Genesis. Russell, and then I want to look at a few texts.
So much of what you describe as technology also describes art. The question, when you say these are creations of human imagination, they are disruptive, they change the way we live, they change the way we think, they are tools that we can implement. How do we distinguish between technology and art?
That's a great question, and I think, by the way, they are more linked than separate, because the word technology comes from the Greek word techne, which also leads to the word technique. And there's, like, we talk about artist techniques. There is a skill that happens here, and art and technology often very much get linked. I think one difference for me is the technology is designed to have a secondary motivation, whereas art has value for its own sake. So art is there to be able to be appreciated as a piece of art. There's no necessarily utilitarian element of art. Something technological is designed to do something as a secondary goal. So, like, we are not using Zoom because Zoom is a beautiful piece of art. We're using Zoom to be able to interact with each other. I don't think there's a bright line necessarily, but I think that art is there to be is lishma, for its own sake, whereas technology is there to be able to achieve a secondary goal. That's at least how I would draw a distinction, but I think they are extremely intertwined because of the methodology is often very similar. So I don't know how that's
I would challenge that distinction, but perhaps another time.
Go ahead. Yeah. Oh, you're muted.
Just to be a little provocative there, if you asked Heather,
Heather's my wife, by the way.
Yeah. If you asked Heather if she had a secondary goal, I bet she'd come up with one.
I think there's like art is designed to be appreciated and looked at, but technology, at least technology, there are innovators who, for example, talk about someone goes to Home Depot and they say, I need to buy a hammer. Well, why do you need to buy a hammer? Because I need to nail something into the wall. What do I need to nail something into the wall? I need to nail a family photo. Why do you need a family photo? Because I want to be able to see my family, right? Like the hammer is not the goal. Seeing the family is being able to see your family. That's the goal there as well. That's taking us in a little bit of a different direction than where I want to be able to focus here, although it's a great question. I'm going to share, and this is another way in which the technology has done wonderful work. There's a website that many of you may see and know called Safaria, and I'll also share some of these texts as well. Text from Safaria, which is from the book of Genesis, looking here at the story of the Garden of Eden. So, as I'm assuming all of you know in some way, that the Garden of Eden is one of the first stories in Genesis. It's the story of how humanity is created. You may or may not know that actually there are two different creation stories in Genesis, and you can do a whole class, and I have, on the differences between the two creation stories in Genesis 1 versus Genesis 2. Genesis 1 tends to be a little bit more cosmic. Genesis 2 tends to be a little bit more earthbound, and it starts by saying that God creates Adam and describes the area, that there was no earth. On the earth there was no grasses of the field, for God had not sent rain upon the earth, and there were no human beings to till the soil. And God formed the human from the soil's humus, not hummus the Mediterranean dip, but humus like the soil, because in Hebrew, the word Adam means human, and the ground humus is Adamah. They're supposed to be a little bit of an evocation. The first human beings, Adam and Eve, in Hebrew, Adam and Chava, translate as human and being. So Adam is a human, is from the humus, or the humus, blowing into the nostrils of the breath of life. The human became a living being. And God planted a garden in the east, and God caused to grow every tree that was pleasing to the sight for food, with the tree of life in the middle of the garden and the tree of knowledge of good and bad. So I'm going to highlight, I just want to bring this up right now. God caused the tree to grow, and there was a tree of life in the middle of the garden and the tree of knowledge of good and bad. That's the first thing we know about. Tree of knowledge of good and bad we know about here. Text then describes a river from Eden, a new collection of rivers here, and then it says God settled the human in the Garden of Eden. The Hebrew is le'ovda u'leshomra. I'm highlighting the Hebrew here. To work it, it says here the English is to till it and to tend it, or to work it and to protect it. So I want to open this up here and get a couple of thoughts of what is the command here? What is Adam supposed to do to the Garden of Eden? What does it imply to be able to work the garden? So I'm when I said let's focus on the Ovda, what does it mean to work the garden? Why is that a command here?
Protect it?
Well, protected is going to be that's later. That's Lishom Ra. We're going to get to that in a couple of minutes, and that's a whole other different question actually as well. So the protected is the second half. Yeah, Doug.
Well, the clear point of this is that this is not going to happen by itself. This is all going to require human effort. The fact that God provided the water to the garden and put the plants there is one thing, but you're not going to get sustenance from that without your own effort.
Right. It is like we think about the Garden of Eden as a paradise where every need is taken of. Every one of your needs is taken care of here. That's actually not what the text says. The Garden of Eden, at least in the Torah, it doesn't say it's a paradise where everything that you could ever want is there. No, there is an element of where it is not going to give you the sustenance that you need. You need to work it. You need to be able to take the natural elements and change them and adapt them here. So terrific. Thank you, Doug. Other thoughts or questions here on this of what the work means? And because I'm sharing my screen, you can also unmute if you would like to just jump in.
How do you tend it without tools?
So that's a great question. How do you tend it without tools? And I think one potential implication could be that they needed to be able to build those tools. There's a discussion in the Mishnah where the rabbis talk about 10 things that were created right before Shabbat came, and they talk about some of the miraculous things that happened. Whether some of them were the donkey before the Balaam's donkey and opening that up. I think Moses' staff, perhaps. I can't remember all 10, but one of them that they said was the tongs that created the first tongs. And why do they talk about the tongs that created the first tongs? The tongs that created the first tongs, that was something that a blacksmith had to use. And blacksmiths were the ones, any kind of tool that you needed in the Iron Age and in the Bronze Age needed to be created in a blacksmith shop. So whether you needed the shearers to be able to prune your garden, or to be able to have a hammer, or to be able to have a nail, you needed to be able to use the tools in your blacksmith. And the thing that you needed, because it was so hot, what did you need in a blacksmith shop? You needed the tongs. But the question is, who created the first tongs? Because you needed the tongs to be able to create the first tongs. And the rabbi said that had to have been miraculously created. So even going back to, again, biblical times and rabbinic times, this question of how did you build these tools? This was a question that the rabbis grappled with. They needed new technological tools to be able to work the land. And so the rabbis would have expanded on this of how could they have worked the land without the tools? Miraculously, God had given Adam the tools that Adam needed to be able to work the garden. So that's a terrific point. So thank you. Other ideas or suggestions? There's a couple more that I'm going to jump in and say, but I want to hear what others have to say about this idea of working the garden. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Yes, also just that you have to till the garden to keep it from descending into chaos.
Mm-hmm.
If it's left alone by itself, it's just going to go back to its natural chaotic state. And that's what you need to do. Otherwise, it really won't be a garden anymore.
Right. To be able to, I am not a gardener. Our house, the landscaping of our house has totally gone to pot. It's not very good. But that is the universe's natural tendency is to go towards chaos. we have to be able to work. We have to be able to invest time and energy to be able to put things back together. This is one of the ideas I have my own issues about the words tikkun olam. I don't love that phrase so much anymore, the way it's been used over the last 15 or 20 years. But I think we can all agree that without investing time and energy, the world is going to naturally go towards chaos. Right? If you can think about this as our society right now, right? The question. This is from a thinker named Steven Pinker, who asks this question of we always ask the question, why is there war? Why is there war? Why is there war? That's not the right question. The right question is, why is there peace? It's very, very easy to be able to devolve into war. It is much, much harder to be able to work, to be able to create a level of peace. It's very easy to destroy. It's much harder to build. And that requires technological systems. It requires social systems. That the idea of working to work, that is something that requires a level of effort here. So if we think about technology even more broadly than just Zoom or the iPhone, but when we think about the technology of the social structures that we build, that is something that is a commandment. We need to work on this. The world is inherently broken, and the world is going to continue to be inherently broken, not because we did anything wrong, and not because we're sinful, and not because the world is bad, but because the universe's natural tendency is to disintegrate into chaos. And it's our responsibility to work there. Le'ovda. And by the way, Ovda has an element of sacred work. You may have heard the phrase in Judaism, the world stands on three things: on Torah, on prayer, and acts of loving kindness. Sometimes we sing about this when we take the Torah out during the Ark. Al shlosha devarim ha'olam omed. The world stands on three things: al haTorah, on Torah; al ha'avodah, the same word, work or service or prayer; ve'al gemilut chasadim, acts of loving kindness. So there is an aspect of work that happens that is sacred work. We are commanded to use our technological know-how to better the world. Comes back to something that Doug that you listed here. There's a wonderful contradiction that comes up with the rabbis that we can think about, of a prayer that we say all the time, which is the motzi, prayer that we say over the bread. How does motzi end? Hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Thank you, God, for bringing forth bread from the earth. What's the problem with that phrase?
He didn't. We did.
Right. Bread doesn't come from the earth. Doug, what were you going to say?
Correct.
Yeah. Right. Wheat comes from the earth. How does bread come from the earth? We till it. But actually now in our 21st century America here, we also have, how does the bread come to our table here? We've got not only the farmers who are threshing the wheat, but there's also the transport that happens and the gas that's required to be able to gas up the trucks and to be able to ensure that we have FDA regulators to make sure that the food is fresh. And we've got supermarkets to be able to have the plastic to be able to put that around. Like there's a lot of work that goes in to be able to say the blessing. It is a blessing to be able to work the land. That is something we are commanded to be able to do. Now, here's the question. Adam is commanded of da, to be able to work, and I think I might have heard Lois's voice on here, of also to lishomra, to be able to guard the Garden of Eden. What is Adam supposed to guard against? The Ovda Shomra. Adam is commanded to till, to work, and to protect. Protect, by definition, means you're protecting from something. What? what is Adam supposed to protect against? People can take a guess too. There are definitely wrong answers. I will say there are like, an asteroid would not be the right answer, but there are a variety of different ways. Yeah.
Animals
Well, okay. Why would you say animals?
to eat what people want to eat.
So yes, that is a possibility, and there are rabbis who bring that up. Except there's at this point there's not a lot of strife or argument with other animals. There's not a lot of competition here. So there's not necessarily protecting against the animals because there isn't enough for people to go around. But that is a natural first guess there for sure. Yeah, Sandra. Oh, you're muted though. Oh, Sandra, you're muted. Yep.
It may be really off the subject, but the only thing I can think of is he was told not to eat from a certain tree. So I would think it might be to protect from that happening with the tree.
Ooh, that's a great point. And I want to highlight, he has not yet been commanded not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
That's going to be a point that we're going to come back to in a couple minutes. Right. So he's commanded to work it and to protect it, but he doesn't yet know about the knowledge of good and evil. So that's a great guess, and we're gonna. But it's a different perspective.
Thank you.
Yeah. Other guesses as to what is Adam supposed to protect against?
If you want to raise your hand, you have to press the raise hand.
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Audrey.
George.
Yep. Audrey and then George. Yep.
Perhaps the withering and dying of the garden.
So to protect, yes, that leads to a little bit of what was said earlier of the garden trying to prevent it from turning into a wasteland. I think
Right.
that is a part of it. Like the work is also pruning and making sure everything the weeds don't take over. I think you're close to what I think a lot of people argue what it might be. So I think that's a really good insight. I think there's something that's even more so here.
The garden needs water.
Right. Water for sure. And so thank you, Audrey. And George, yeah.
No, my thought was the same, to prevent from returning to chaos.
Returning, so that's, I think that is an element, which by the way links with the working. This is why I think they go hand in hand. To work is both to be able to prevent it from turning into chaos, but I think what a few rabbis have said is what Adam is supposed to protect against is against le'obdah, of doing too much work. This is something that we tend to do, particularly in America right now. But it's also this is not a new question of we tend to work so much that we overwork. This is one of the questions that's coming up with surrounding climate change. Right? What happens when we overwork a particular resource? We need to protect ourselves from overworking. So the working is hugely valuable, and at the same time, we need to be able to protect ourselves from overworking. So that comes. They're
Mary and Bannon.
They're linked here to be able to say they come together. And then linking to this question of what Sandra had said, after God commanded it to the garden to work and to tend it, God commanded the human, saying, of every tree of the garden you are free to eat, but as for the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you must not eat of it, for for as soon as you eat of it, you shall die. And so the way that I often read this is by looking at the question that technology outpaces ethics. Adam is commanded to be able to work the land, to be able to create and use the natural resources that are there, that he has as part of the access of what he has for in the Garden of Eden, to be able to, as everyone was saying, cultivate, build, grow, enhance, and at the same time, he may not know what the implications are going to be of his technological advancements. It isn't until after he eats from the tree of knowledge of good and evil does he realize, oh my goodness, I made some mistakes here. Yeah, Doug, go ahead.
Are there two different trees? Because they talk about the tree of life and then they talk about the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
Yes.
I'm not sure where the tree of life comes back in this story.
So the tree of life, so yes, and that is that comes up a lot, is that yes, so there's the tree of life, and then after Adam eats from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that's where that's after he eats, that's when God says, I need to kick you out of the garden because then you may eat from the tree of life and live forever. And so, and by the way, the command, it says here, the tree of life is in the middle of the garden and the tree of knowledge of good and bad. Here it says, of every tree you are free to eat, but the tree of knowledge of good and bad, you must not eat of it, for as soon as you shall die. We don't know, is there another tree that's also, because there's another tree that's in the middle of the garden. There are definitely there are at least two named trees in Genesis. But one is the tree of knowledge of good and evil, not an apple, by the way, that's a whole other discussion. The tree of knowledge of good and evil, and the other is the tree of life. And some of this is designed to be able to share that when we know things, that's how we grow as adults. As we get older and older and older, the more that we know, and a lot of trying to teach children of good and evil. That's a lot of what parenting is about, is how do you teach good and evil. Ultimately, as you get older, you go through your life cycle and you end up dying, because if we were to live forever, there would be no new knowledge to be able to grow. There's life. I think it was Kafka who said the purpose of life is that it ends. Knowing that we have an expiration date means that we get to share our knowledge from one generation to the next, and the technology of written text, written traditions, technical know-how that gets passed from one generation to the next. So this is a little bit of an introduction to some of these questions of how we look at Genesis 2, and it links to a text that I want to share that is slightly more recent, a text that an author that I'm sure all of you have heard of, a guy named Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was one of the great thinkers of Jewish thinking. He was ordained, or I believe he was ordained at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, and then moved to the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. He's somebody that all three denominations claim. He marched with Martin Luther King Jr. at Selma. He has been somebody who's been celebrated for decades and decades and decades. He's written multiple books. English was his third language, and he wrote a classic book called The Sabbath, excerpts of which I am sure you have read because they're used almost all the time in every prayer book. But what I want to share a little bit of this. And what is incredible to me is the section that we're going to read. The book The Sabbath was written in 1952. So it is 70 years old. So these questions of technological elements and the interplay of work and overwork and rest and work, these are not new questions. These are certainly thousands of years old, but even these questions that Heschel brings up are ones that we are grappling with here and are written from about 70 years ago. So I am going to pull up and and actually, I'll even make this a little bit larger. Hopefully people can see. Can I get, because I've been speaking a lot and want to rest my voice for a second, can I get somebody to be able to read these little sections here? Hopefully everyone can read this here, but would love someone to read for those who may not have it in front of their screens. Anybody who's got a nice, clear voice to be able to read for a little bit. And whoever would like to can unmute.
I don't think you brought up the Heschel text.
Oh, is it not? Is it
No,
not
it's
up?
still on the previous page.
All right, I'm gonna, hold on, I'm gonna, hopefully this will work. I'm gonna, oops. I'm gonna stop sharing and, share the Heschel. Is that up now?
Yes.
Okay, terrific. All right, Sandra, go ahead. Thank you. You're muted though. You just remuted it.
I begin with technical civilization.
Yep. And by the way, I'm going to apologize in advance for the gendered language. This was written 70 years ago, and this is not copied from into a Word document where I could change the gendered language. So when he says man, understand he means humanity. This was how it was written 70 years ago. So go ahead. Sorry.
Technical civilization is the product of labor, of man's exertion of power for the sake of gain, for the sake of producing goods. It begins when man, dissatisfied with what is available in nature, becomes engaged in a struggle with the forces of nature in order to enhance his safety and to increase his comfort. To use the language of the Bible, the task of civilization is to subdue the earth, to have dominion over the beast. How proud we often are of our victories in the war with nature, proud of the multitude of instruments we have succeeded in inventing, of the abundance of commodities we have been able to produce. Yet our victories have come to resemble defeats. In spite of our triumphs, we have fallen victims to the work of our hands. It is as if the forces we had conquered have conquered us. Is our civilization a way to disaster, as many of us are prone to believe? Is civilization essentially evil to be rejected and condemned? The faith of the Jew is not a way out of this world, but a way of being within and above this world, not to reject, but to surpass civilization. The Sabbath is the day on which we learn the art of surpassing civilization. Adam was placed in the Garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it.
And that's the Hebrew of Da'u L'Shomra. There's a lot of different translations here. Yep.
Labor is not only the destiny of man, it is endowed with divine dignity.
Thank you. And can I get someone to pick up here on, let me just move this here.
Yeah.
Yep. Thank you, Sandra. Can I get another person to be able to pick up here, however, after 8?
However,
Go ahead. Somebody else can. Go ahead, Judith.
However, after he ate of the tree of knowledge, he was condemned to toil, not only to labor. In toil shalt thou eat all the days of thy life. Labor is a blessing. Toil is the misery of man. The Sabbath, as a day of abstaining from work, is not a depreciation, but an affirmation of labor, a divine exaltation of its dignity. Thou shalt abstain from labor on the seventh day is a sequel to the command, 6 days shalt thou labor and do all the work. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all the work, but the seventh day is Sabbath unto the Lord thy God. Just as we are commanded to keep the Sabbath, we are commanded to labor. Love work. The duty to work for 6 days is just as much a part of God's covenant with man as the duty to abstain from work on the seventh day. To set apart 1 day a week for freedom, a day on which we would not use the instruments which have been so easily turned into weapons of destruction, a day for being with ourselves, a day of detachment from the vulgar, of independence of external obligations, a day on which we stop worshiping the idols of technical civilization, a day on which we use no money, a day of armistice in the economic struggle with our fellow men and forces of nature. Is there any institution that holds out a greater hope for man's progress than the Sabbath? The solution of mankind's most vexing problem will not be found in renouncing technical civilization, but in attaining some degree of independence of it.
Terrific, thank you. And then Karen, do you want to finish here the last little, sorry, in regard, and then you'll go on to the next little page here.
In regard to external gifts, to outward possessions, there is only one proper attitude: to have them and to be able to do without them. On the Sabbath, we live, as it were, independent of technical civilization. We abstain primarily from any activity that aims at remaking, reshaping the things of space. Man's royal privilege to conquer nature is suspended on the seventh day.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you. Karen, why don't you finish us off here?
Oh, yeah? Okay. So what are the kinds of labor not to be done on the Sabbath? They are, according to the ancient rabbis, all those acts which were necessary for the construction and furnishing of the sanctuary in the desert. The Sabbath itself is a sanctuary, which we build, a sanctuary in time. It is one thing to race or be driven by the vicissitudes that menace life, and another thing to stand still and to embrace the presence of an eternal moment. The seventh day is the armistice in man's cruel struggle for existence, a truce in all conflicts, personal and social, peace between man and nature, peace within man, a day on which handling money is considered a desecration, on which man avows his independence of that which is the world's chief idol. The seventh day is the exodus from tension, the liberation of man from his own muddiness, the installation of man as a sovereign in the world of time. In the tempestuous ocean of time and toil, there are islands of stillness where man may enter a harbor and reclaim his dignity. The island is the seventh day, the Sabbath, a day of detachment from things, instruments, and practical affairs, as well as of attachment to the spirit.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to stop here and want to open this up as we heard this text, which, as I said, 70 years ago that was written. So I don't know if it was Judy who had said at the beginning, or somebody who had said at the beginning of technology always feels like it's advancing quickly by the millisecond. This was something that was 70 years ago. These are questions here as well. So I want to open this up as hearing this. I'm sure people have heard the phrase "the sanctuary in time," which is something that we often talk about on Shabbat. But how does this sit with people of what he describes as Shabbat here?
You want to unmute and raise your hand? You don't have it?
Yeah, go ahead. Shields family.
No.
It's all right.
We're
It's a day to spend with our family.
Say it again.
Well, it's a day to spend with our family. We go to sharing Shabbat whenever it's be with our grandchildren, and that's very important to us. Anything you want to add, Karen? And we're together the whole day.
There's something of being present here in a different kind of way. Judith and then Doug.
To me, I love the idea of the Sabbath. I have tried just to turn off my computer for the day and not turn it on again till Saturday night. I did it. I cannot do it all the time. We are slaves to this technology and to being constantly connected. And I think this is where technology has really robbed us of something very important: peace. I know one rabbi asked, what do you pray for? And to me, I pray for peace, and not only in the wars and things, but my own peace. And I think technology is really a contender with man as far as finding the sanctuary of the Sabbath. Anyway.
So you're highlighting a challenge, which is what does technology look like in 24/7 societies? And this was a big question that came up, for example, during COVID, and continues to be here. I belong to a fairly observant conservative synagogue. I'm a member of Temple Israel Center of White Plains, which tends to be a little bit more observant of Jewish law, and yet during COVID there were exigencies to be able to allow people to use screens on Shabbat. And if some of you may, for example, see, like Central Synagogue has created a whole virtual community here. So there are elements in which the screens and the use of computer makes it harder to observe Shabbat in a more traditional setting. And yet, are there ways in which we can say no to other elements, right? So is there something of not using money? Are there ways of using less money than usual, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be a binary decision of I'm going to observe Shabbat or I'm not going to observe Shabbat, but are there ways of saying I am going to, at least for 25 hours, renounce elements of this so that I am not dominated by what the technical civilization looks like? Let me get Diane and then Russell and then Doug.
It's difficult if you live in the world to completely isolate yourself and have Shabbat the way it was described here. And just an example, if you live in this community, your children, unless they're going to day school, are involved in sports, and you're running on Saturday to the baseball game and the football practice and the basketball game. There's no way to avoid it and be part of the larger society unless you immerse yourself in an Orthodox community and a day school.
Yeah, I mean that it raises a question of Shabbat as a particularly Jewish practice versus a universal practice, and this is something that's come particularly since the Enlightenment of Jews being integrated in with the wider society. This was, by the way, why the Reform movement in the late early 1900s changed Shabbat to Sundays, because that was when churches were going there, and so Saturday people could do commerce there. And yet there are ways in which there is an integration that can happen. That it is challenging, and this is why one of the great things and challenging things of Reform Judaism is that it offers so much choice. One of the positive things, at least of Orthodox Judaism, is the removal of choice, a conscious removal of choice. I'll phrase it that way, of those who say, I want to be in an area where I don't have to think anymore. That can be a really helpful decision of like, I know where I'm going. And there are downsides of that, of being able to, there are times when I am taking my kids to Little League on Saturday mornings because that's where our town has Little League games. But the idea of in Shabbat as ensuring that we are using technology and not technology using us, that's where that interplay comes in. So great point. Thank you. Let me get Russell. There are a lot of hands here. So we go Russell, Rob, Audrey, Doug, and George.
Thank you very much. I guess it's hard to, not having read the entire piece, to take this passage out of context. But it seems to regard Shabbat and through it faith as the refuge from technology, which is a little too my thinking, a little too reminiscent of the papal denunciations of Galileo, these many hundreds of years ago. And the sad lesson of history is, first, you cannot stop technology or science from developing, even if you want to. And number two, if you assume that technology is the enemy of faith, you're going to lead to rejections of progress and a denial, ultimately, of what makes us special, what makes us human as God's creation.
Although I think what Heschel says is that the technology is actually to be celebrated. In fact, he thinks that work is divine dignity, that there is, the faith of the Jew is not to reject the world. It is not to be apart from the world, but to be a part of the world. That is what it means to be Jewish. There is a key element of this here.
I think you're giving that a very, very charitable reading, because I think what he is saying is that we need to use this. Yes, that all of that is true, but we still need to take Shabbat as the rest from all of that technological noise.
As one day a week. That's right. It is not to be an ascetic 7 days a week. It's to be able to, and it's not even to be an ascetic here, because there's also, this is the other thing that he brings up and highlights, which is that there are certain, what is the question of work? So what work means for us in 21st century America is not what work is described in the Torah and in rabbinic literature. Work is fairly specifically defined. It's not that narrow, but it is pretty specifically defined, of 39 categories of work, the 39 things that were used to be able to build the sanctuary in the desert. Anything that was designed to be able to build something in space, that is forbidden on Shabbat. So that's where there's a lighting of a fire. So there are elements of reading is there, but one of the goals of Shabbat is to not create something that is going to last forever. At least in traditional Judaism. So our synagogue, for example, they live stream. There's a live stream. There's a passive live stream that is there, but it is not recorded. Why? Because there is something that happens in that particular moment that can't be captured. Technology is, at least in theory, not everything lasts forever, but technology is there to be able to build on for future generations. Shabbat is a moment in time, and that's why it's celebrated here, and that's why Heschel talks about there's a difference between work and toil. That there are any kind of technology, as comes back also from the beginning of Genesis, of technology comes before we know what's good or bad. Technology gets used, and then we discover how is it being used. And there are certain technologies that get used that are misused, but all the technologies, in my mind, are inherently amoral. It's a question of how they are used, and can they be used as a force for good. But it's. I mean, I think if you look at the Heschel again, he very clearly says technology and technical civilization is wonderful, and the challenge is that it has always been something that has dominated who we are, and that's been a challenge throughout human history. Let me get Audrey and then Rob.
Part of the problem is that when these laws were written, there was no technology akin to what we have today. So had there been the same things, they might have not written it the way it is. For instance, what if you want to go and observe Shabbat services in person? Certainly for us, we have to drive a car because we're 20 minutes away by car. I mean, and that would not have been okay. So that, because you have to light the spark to rev your engine. So I think that my problem with all of this is that when these laws were written, that was okay for that time. Were they to be written today, they might be written differently. And so I think that even I had a lot of Orthodox neighbors, and even in your strict observance of Shabbat, people would cheat. They would hide, they would smoke their cigarettes or whatever. Because it's very hard when you live 6 days a week with such a difference in technology to observe it completely.
And I think you're right. So on one level, you are right that technology has continued to change, and I think there are a few moments in history or eras in history where there was a very much of a sea change. So one was, for example, the agricultural revolution. That was a big change. The Industrial Revolution is another. The Enlightenment it was another. And I think the advent of computers, and the internet, that is also a little bit of a sea change. And yet the human questions are ones that are ancient. So they did not know, in the same way that the rabbis did not know what Zoom was going to look like, or apps, or paper currency, or e-cash. Like they did not know about that. But the questions of privacy, that's a question that they grappled with. Transportation, that's a question that comes up. We're going to see this throughout our course. You're right that the rabbis and the biblical authors did not know, by definition, they did not know or understand the new technologies, and yet the questions are ones that are very, very ancient. How do we build something? That you talk about the Tower of Babel, and the Tower of Babel, which was building a tower up to heaven. That required a level of technological advancement. I think one of the questions that comes up a lot in technology is what is the difference of degree versus kind? And most technological advancements are differences of degree. They are, but this is also why a lot of Reform rabbis, but particularly conservative and definitely Orthodox rabbis, give halakhic responses to be able to say, here's what we think you should do. And by the way, Reform rabbis are going to respond differently than conservative rabbis, which are going to respond different than Orthodox rabbis. You raised this question of going to Shabbat services. In a very, very traditional Orthodox community, no, you can't do that. In a Reform community, drive wherever you want. And in the conservative movement, a lot of the rules are you can drive as long as you're going to Shabbat services. Right. So and there's always the difference as well between the law that's being promulgated versus what's actually being observed. So these are questions where there are new manifestations of these questions, and the specific issues, yes, are very, very new and one the rabbis didn't know about. And yet there is wisdom to be able to look at how do we make sure that the creations we make don't take over our lives. That's a kings had all this wealth and money. That's something that we're grappling with, of how do we create a level of economic justice, and what's the interplay of capitalism and socialism? That's a question that people were grappling with 3,000 years ago. So Rob, I want to get so thank you, Audrey, but yeah, Rob, go ahead.
It's Aaron.
Hi.
I actually think that there needs to be more nuance to the conversation. It shouldn't just be all or nothing, because that's not possible, nor is it really showing control over anything to just be, I'm not allowed to. I would argue there's more power in being able to pick up your phone, but only using it for the purposes of like, hey, do you want to meet me for lunch today? Or, I got Ellie, and then scrolling social media, responding to work emails. Like, you can have the spirit of the law where you're choosing what technology you allow in your life on Shabbat, and how you use that, as opposed to for toil. When you just take away someone's choice and say, well, you can't use your phone at all, that's not actually control. that's just black boxing something. That's like saying, well, you can't buy alcohol until you're 21. That's not a person choosing to use technology only for good. So I actually like the way that Reform Judaism approaches this, because they put all the onus on the person to make the choices, to have control, to not look at social media, to not respond to work emails, and to be present. Me choosing to put down my phone is way more of an active participation in my life than someone else taking it away from me.
So you bring up a really important point, which is what we might call the Platonic ideal of Reform Judaism, which is why I still identify as a Reform Jew, of making the conscious choice of how to act in this world, particularly, and this is a question that came up in Enlightenment Judaism. Reform Judaism came as a result of the Enlightenment and the integration with the wider world. And by the way, modern Orthodox Judaism came as a response to Reform Judaism. There's a line from Arnold Jacob Wolff, who once said, and I love this line, and it's provocative, and it's a little bit of oversimplification. He said, "There's no Judaism except Orthodoxy, but all Jews are really Reform," which I think is a nice framing of, we are all looking at the same texts. If I were to look at this text, if I was to teach about technology, I can be sharing, and I have the same access as an Orthodox rabbi or an Orthodox Jew to be able to look at these questions. We all have the same corpus that we look at. How we interpret it is going to be different group by group. And even Orthodox Jews, in some ways, are Reform, because they are the ones who are saying, I am choosing to take this on in this way. So you're right of an institution or an organization saying you're not allowed to do this, that's oppressive. But being able to say from yourself, I am choosing not to do this, that can be liberating, right? In the same way that people make decisions about what food do they want to eat in some ways, right? Some people, they make a decision for health reasons, but some people will say, I am choosing to be vegetarian because that is better for the earth and has a better impact on the environment. It's not saying I can't eat meat. It's saying I am choosing to be vegetarian. So that is the element of where does the technology be used consciously? I think that's a great point that you brought up of how do we use the technology in a way that is I think both the spirit of the law, and there is value to be able to have, here are some of the guidelines. Here's why these particular rules are outlined the way they are. And which is why I think it is, at least in the Reform movement, for those of us who are here, observing Shabbat the way it is described in traditional Judaism is not an achievable goal for us. That is not doable. And yet there are ways in which it can be meaningful. Shabbat, there are two ways in which Shabbat is described. One is to zachor et Shabbat, and one is shamor et Shabbat, to remember Shabbat and to guard Shabbat. Remember Shabbat is proactively doing things that make Shabbat special. So traditionally, that's having a nice meal, that's having wine, that's candles, that's they're going to synagogue. There are ways in which, again, different people do different elements, but that's an element of saying yes. Shamor Shabbat is saying no, but it's saying no to fewer things to be able to say yes to better things. So it could be, for example, I am saying no to have my phone so that I can be fully present. My phone is off on the side right now. I am sure that I have a bunch of texts and emails that I need to respond to. Right? I could choose to do that, but I am choosing not to be responding to my emails right now because I'm here with all of you. So saying no to certain things allows us to be able to say yes to others. So I mean, that's a great point of how do we make that conscious decision of the ways in which the technology is going to manifest itself. By the way, not just on Shabbat, but in our lives. and being able to actually have a structure to be able to say, these are the elements that we use all the time. How can I make Shabbat feel different from the rest of the week? Doug.
I'm thinking of the source of the prohibitions against technology. And I want to use a couple of terms that we learned from Rabbi Blake. What we learned, the Orayata from Torah, is kind of straightforward. The seventh day shall be sacred, you shall do no work. The rest of it that we get, the Rabbanan from the rabbis, the multiple lists of prohibitions, that's all been accreted on. Mm-hmm. And with all due respect for, my Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox co-religionists, a lot of it just seems to me in taking the prohibitions that come the Rabbanan, seem to be, not to be, dismissive of it, but it seem to be ways in which I'm fooling God. I can't take an elevator, but I'm not going to forego the technology of elevators. I'm just going to use what's called a Shabbat elevator, which stops at every door. I'm not going to actually tear my toilet paper today, but I'll do it, yesterday. Mm-hmm. I can't carry things, from one place to another, but I'm going to put up a wire along telephone poles and call that an eruv, so that I can do these things. And so my larger point is that many of these prohibitions, if taken to some extent, just seem to be, how can I fool God?
So it's an interesting perspective. So one is that the theology and rabbinic theology is not necessarily a punishing God for violating mitzvot. That's even, I think, the most Orthodox or observant of Jews would not say that violating particular mitzvot would mean that you're a grease spot. Like that's God. They don't view God working in that way. But it highlights this tension that we're going to be looking at throughout this course, which is the role of technology and the role of religion. That an eruv is an eruv, which, by the way, if you don't know, it's as someone once said, it's an old Hebrew word for loophole, which is a little bit of so in traditional Judaism, you are not supposed to carry something from the private domain into the public domain, but you are allowed to carry from the private domain within a private domain. So an eruv is a little string that happens all around that says, okay, this area of Manhattan or this area of White Plains, that is private. So you can carry your driver's license if you need to. You can carry your keys to be able to get into your house. So but that question of what is the new technological innovation? That is a question where rabbis have to make halakhic decisions, rabbinic decisions of what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, and all sorts of new technologies again raise questions that we then have to respond to afterwards. I can't remember who had brought up this. Might have been Audrey who had said 3,000 years ago the rabbis didn't know about apps and iPhone and cars and things along those lines, and because they didn't know about those kinds of questions. But there have always been new technologies that have come into existence that have required some sort of religious response, ethical response, that tries to both keep in spirit what the spirit of the rule is, and to be able to have a practical answer to what's happening. This is one thing that Sinai and Synapses, that my organization is starting to really think about, which is how do we think about the question of technology, both in terms of the long-term philosophical eternal questions and the immediate rapid response. Because about a year ago, everybody was talking about ChatGPT And is this going to destroy education? And education still exists, right? There are still ways in which schools are happening right now, but there's been a little bit of an equilibrium. So people have had to make rules of here's what's allowed, here's what's not allowed, trying to be able to know what's going to happen with these new technologies using some of our ancient texts and ancient thoughts as well. I know we're almost at the end of time. I know were there a couple of hands that came up. I wanted, if there were, yes, go ahead, Rita.
I want to go back to one of your original premises, which was that the world is heading toward chaos, that unless we intervene, we will have chaos. And I'm not sure that I accept that division. And I think that many processes of entropy do eventually lead to order. We are going to blow up at some point. The sun is burning itself out. But if it didn't burn every day, we wouldn't be here. So the very sunlight that we use to create order and growth and sustain life is also changing in a more chaotic way, if you will, the end of the universe. The new pictures coming in from the telescopes are showing such an amazingly ordered universe in ways that we never thought before. And the idea of being more nuanced, there was a word was used before, that order and chaos are not opposites of each other. They work together, just as Shabbat and rest and work are not opposites. Rabbis work every Saturday with their voice. And if you're allowed to speak on Shabbat, you can do a lot of trouble in the world and you can do a lot of good in the world. So I think we get in trouble when we try to have very definite divisions between what's order and what's chaos, what's work and what's rest.
So you're right, and it's not a clear line as we think. Couple of responses. One is rabbis work almost every Shabbat, but again the halachic rabbinic definition of work is very specific. So rabbis can use their voice, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're using their voice for good. Hopefully, all rabbis are using their voice for good, right? Like there are ways in which all of our technologies, again, are amoral. But a lot of the goal of Shabbat is being able to at least pause and reflect so that we're not on a treadmill. And I think that's Joel Hoffman, who's a thinker, had said that if Judaism were to die out forever, the one thing that Judaism is going to survive forever is the idea of the weekend. That's the one thing that's going to last forever. Of the need to be able to rest and reflect, and as Martin Buber would often say, to be in an I-thou relationship versus an I-it relationship. So that's one element. And the other question that I wanted to bring up of the order versus chaos, which is that there's a difference between order and complexity. The universe is becoming more complex. And as far as we know right now, the human brain is the most complex thing that exists in the universe, as far as we know right now. But that requires a level of energy. And there is waste that comes in. There are technical definitions of what entropy and chaos are. But investing time and energy, there is always an offshoot. There's always a level of waste that comes from using the chaotic materials to create something that has more complexity. There's always a loss of order that happens there, unless we are the ones who work to be able to build it. This was a lot. I know that. So thank you for a fascinating first class. I got through about a third of the number of texts that I was going to look at. But I'm happy to send. I think I can send, or I can ask to Natalie. I can send. There are a couple of texts that I was going to look at. If you want to see slightly more advanced text, there's a book called Halachic Man by Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, who is an Orthodox Jew, modern Orthodox, who talks about the technological world and the creations of Adam. I'll send that along to be able to forward here as soon as we're off as well. I am away next week. I'm on a family vacation flying out on Shabbat, which I don't love, but that's the only time when our flight is. So there's no class next Thursday, but we'll be back on the 25th. And hopefully you have my email. If there are questions that come in, I'll put it in the chat as well. But thank you all for taking your time and questions. And these are not easy and solvable questions. These are ones that we will be looking at. Well, not just these few weeks, but for many, many, many years to come. So I just put my email in the chat, and I will forward along the text that we're going to look at. But wishing you all an early Shabbat Shalom, however you celebrate it and observe it. And I hope it's a meaningful one that is refreshing and peaceful for you all.
Yasher Koach, Rabbi.
Baruch Tieh.